Good afternoon, Dr. Fingar and Dr. Harding and Dr. Shirley Lin, and our distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's great event. I'm Yang Wanyin, the Dean of College of Social Science. It's my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Thomas Fingar, a renowned scholar in comparative politics and international relations. Before returning to the academia at Stanford in 2009, Dr. Fingar had previously served as Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis, and concurrently as the Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. In his role as analysis, he reported to the U.S. President and the Secretary of State, and significantly influencing policy making. With over 20 years service in Washington, Dr. Fingar had received numerous awards from the U.S. President government for his distinguished service and leadership in the intelligence community. And in his role as a political scientist, he has written many books and articles in comparative and Chinese politics and international relations. He is a short-stint Asia-Pacific Research Fellow at Stanford University currently. So combining the essence of practicing and academia, Dr. Fingar's talk today will tell us how intelligence influences policy making in today's divided world. Dear guests, today's event is a joint effort by the NCCU Yushan Fellowship by Professor Harding, the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation, CAPRI, funded by Shirley Lin, and the College of Social Science at NCCU. The Yushan Fellowship program is sponsored by the Taiwan's Ministry of Education to attract global talent into Taiwan's higher education. Meanwhile, CAPRI is an international think tank specialized in comparative policy research in Asia-Pacific regions. And lastly, the CSS at NCCU is Taiwan's most comprehensive higher education provider in the field of social science and international Asia-Pacific graduate programs. In conjunction with the 30th anniversary of the establishment of our College of Social Science, we are organizing the Refocusing Asia lecture series, which includes today's event. As we all know, Asia is the most important geopolitical hubs in the world. And I believe that our college can make a big impact by not only conducting top-notch research in Asia-Pacific issues, but also nurturing young talents with the social innovation capability to tackle real-world issues problems. We will aim for our CSS students and graduates to become leaders in society and global citizens who can strive in multicultural settings and continue to excel in today's competitive international environment. Without further ado, let's invite Dr. Harry Harding, our Yushan Scholar, to tell us more about Dr. Fingar. And after Dr. Fingar's talk today, Shirley will lead the discussion. And please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Yang. I'd like to join you in welcoming everyone here to today's public forum, co-sponsored by the College of Social Science, the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation, and the Yushan Fellows Program. As many of you know, and as Dean Yang has just said, CAPRI is Taiwan's first independent, nonpartisan public policy think tank that is specializing in conducting comparative analysis of the ways in which societies in the Asia-Pacific, especially high-income societies, are addressing their most serious problems, or what Tom is going to say are the most wicked problems, the most difficult ones to resolve. and then to share the findings of that research with both the region and the rest of the world. I am a board member and the founder of and chair of CAPRI. My wife, Charlotte Shirley Lin, is also here today. And as you now know, she will be helping lead the discussion, the question and answer period. And let me add, to give you a fuller sort of timeline for today's events, it's after the Q&A period that you will be able to go outside and get some lunch. We have some wonderful lunch boxes available for you, but given the beautiful renovation of this room, we cannot eat any food within this space. I'm sure you can understand that. The Yushan Scholar Program was created to enable Taiwan to attract internationally outstanding scholars and experts to Taiwan, to strengthen Taiwan's research and teaching programs, and to promote international student and faculty exchange between Taiwan's institutions of higher education and their partners abroad. As both a Yushan Scholar at National Chengchi University and a member of the board of directors of CAPRI, it's been my pleasure and my honor to welcome Tom Fingar to Taiwan to participate in a series of public and invitation-only events sponsored by these two organizations. Now, I say it's both my pleasure and my honor. And I say that because, first, it's my pleasure, because Tom and I have known each other for nearly half a century now. A friendship that began when we both started our study of Chinese language in a summer program at Columbia University. A friendship that developed further when we began doctoral studies together in political science at Stanford University, and then deepened further when we came to Taiwan to study Chinese at the Inter-University Program for Chinese Studies, more commonly known as the Stanford Center, because it was then administered by Stanford University. That program was housed in a beautiful old Japanese-style building on the National Taiwan University campus, which I believe still exists today. Now, you have already received Tom Fingar's biography when you were invited to this program, and Dean Young just highlighted a few parts of it in her very kind introduction. But let me add a few details that are not included there, based on my long-standing friendship of Tom and knowledge of many accomplishments that he has been made and the important role that those accomplishments have made in a variety of venues in the United States and in U.S.-China relations and indeed the forecasting of global affairs. After receiving his PhD at Stanford, Tom remained there to help develop and to administer two important research and exchange programs: the Arms Control and Disarmament Program, and then even more significantly, the U.S.-China Relations Program. This experience gave him direct knowledge of how universities such as Stanford manage visiting scholars from abroad. This gave him a unique position to help advise the U.S. government on how to establish academic exchange programs with China, especially in science and technology, which were one of the key components of the 1978 agreement to normalize U.S.-China relations. Now, those exchange programs have, of course, become very controversial in the United States in recent years, among those who fear that they may represent a threat to American national security issues. But I think Tom can tell you that at the time these programs were under consideration and being developed, they were also controversial in China for exactly the same reasons. But it was Deng Xiaoping who believed that these exchange programs would be critically important to China's modernization program and would also be a way of balancing some of the relationships between the United States and Taiwan that Washington insisted on continuing after normalization. With normalization complete, Tom joined the State Department on a full-time basis, serving for many years as a key member of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence Research, commonly known as INR, a kind of abbreviation. He began as an analyst conducting research and analysis on China. Then he rose to cover the entire East Asia Pacific region, and then finally the entire world, rising to the levels of Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis, Deputy Assistant Secretary I guess, for everything, and then the Assistant Secretary itself. Under Tom's leadership, INR developed a reputation for the quality of its analysis and its willingness to dissent from the other members of the American intelligence community with which it disagreed. As some of you may know, INR was the member of the intelligence community that dissented from the general assessment that Iraq had acquired weapons of mass destruction under its leader Saddam Hussein, thereby justifying the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. And as you may remember, INR's dissent was fully justified when the American military discovered no weapons of mass destruction in the country that it had just invaded and occupied. So that while the dissent was not widely welcomed within the American government, perhaps at the time it was issued, it was fully vindicated by subsequent events. The respect that Tom earned as head of INR led him to be appointed or reappointed to that position by several different administrations, both Republican and Democrat. To this day, as well as I know Tom, I do not know what his party affiliation is, or even if he has one. Knowing him as I do, I have never bothered to ask, because I know that it does not matter. Because Tom is a true, nonpartisan intelligence professional. After the terrorist attacks on the United States in September 2011, Washington created a new office, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as a way to better coordinate the work of the diverse American intelligence community, especially at that time on the issue of global terrorism. The idea was to bring together the insight that each agency could separately provide. When that office was created, on the basis of his record at INR, Tom was appointed the first Deputy Director of National Intelligence for analysis. Tom also chaired the National Intelligence Council, comprising all the national intelligence officers responsible for major countries, regions, and issues of concern to the United States. At the same time, Tom was also responsible for overseeing the process that wrote the daily intelligence briefs for the presidents that he served. And in some cases, Tom presented those assessments to the serving president personally. He was also responsible for the process that researched and wrote the quadrennial reports forecasting global trends, intended for use by each incoming presidential administration, whether it was newly elected or re-elected. These reports were unclassified and publicly available and shared with other intelligence communities abroad as well. Therefore, they were of great interest and value to other members of the American analytic and scholarly communities, and indeed to scholars and analysts around the world. When I taught courses on political forecasting and political risk assessment in my previous positions at George Washington University and the University of Virginia, these global trends reports were required readings for my students as models of their kind. So I hope you can understand why I say it is both a great personal pleasure and a high honor to have Tom Fingar come to Taiwan and join us in this program today. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Fingar to the podium to give his remarks.
Thank you, Harry, for that over-the-top introduction, and Yang for your remarks as well. I would love to change the practice of giving brief introductions to the speaker and put them at the end to help you decide whether the talk was worthy of the introduction. Makes it very hard to live up to the expectations based on who I once was. But I am truly very happy to be back here in Taiwan, be back in this room. It's 10 years since I last gave talks in this lecture hall, and I'm delighted to be back. I'm very appreciative to CAPRI, to Zhengda, and to the School of Social Sciences for making this visit and this talk possible And finally, I'm grateful to all of you who've given up a portion of your day and maybe your lunchtime to be here right now. That this is an example of a talk where the persons inviting me assign a title. And I say, that's cool. I haven't thought much about that. This is a good opportunity to pull together lessons, expectations, aspirations that have kicked around and try to put it together in one coherent presentation. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity because I think three dimensions of the title warrant singling out or underscoring here. One is the role of intelligence, national intelligence in policymaking in the United States. That I will be speaking based on the U.S. system, which is different than that in pretty much every other country in the world. It's different in one respect. There is no internal police national security function as there are in most countries. The second is the role of analysis in informing decisions by policymakers. And the third is the importance of analysis, which in the United States governmental structure is performed largely in the intelligence community. That's where the analysts live. The answer to the question of why do you go to the intelligence services for some of the kind of questions that I will address in this talk is that's where the analysts are. It's like the explanation attributed to Willie Sutton, a bank robber, when asked why he robbed banks. And his putative answer was, because that's where the money is. The U.S. government and a number of non-governmental entities turn to the intelligence community not because it has secrets, not because it has unique capabilities, but because that's where the experienced and well-informed analysts are. So what I want to do this afternoon is to address some of the roles of intelligence. In doing that, to perhaps provide illustrations, examples, references to structure that might be helpful as you think about structures, organizations, approaches here in Taiwan, their suitability for addressing the kinds of global challenges that I'll use to illustrate wicked problems, and then close that out with how the intelligence analysis can be used, has been used, in building international support or collaboration on some of these hard issues. I'll begin by making a flat-out statement. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, thinks they know something, maybe a lot, about intelligence, about the U.S. intelligence community. The flat-out statement is everything you know or think you know is probably wrong. We get our input from the movies, from Jean Le Carré novels. It's very exciting, the daring do, Mission Impossible. In the real world, there are far fewer Jason Bournes and Ethan Hales than there are hardworking professionals who labor below the radar, out of sight. I made a very good career of not having my name on very many things. Actually, that's not true. My name is on, give or take, 14,000 memos to the Secretary of State and 20,000 reports to the President. But the importance is not the name. The importance is the quality of the work that others did. I get credit because I could sign it. The U.S. intelligence community is not omniscient. It doesn't know everything that's going on in the world in real time. It doesn't know everything that's going on in the world, even not in real time. But it does have tremendous capabilities, collects extraordinarily large amounts of information, terabytes of data every hour, the equivalent of the total holdings of the Library of Congress, the world's largest library, every day before lunch. And it runs 24/7, sucking in almost entirely unclassified materials. Newspapers, radio, TV broadcasts, published reports, academic papers. It's a big pile of information. Finding the needles in that haystack of information is the job of intelligence analysts. It's the job of scholars. Many of the aspects of scholarly research are similar or even identical to what an intelligence analyst do, but some important ones are not. And I hope to make the differences, some of the differences, clear. What you really need to know about intelligence in the U.S. government is that it is a support function. It informs, but neither drives nor dictates policy decisions. Some of you in the room, I think, are old enough to remember a long-running commercial by the German chemical firm BASF. Commercial said, "We do not make a lot of the products you buy. We make a lot of the products you buy better." The role of intelligence support is to provide information and insight that will enable decision makers to be better informed, to have broader and deeper understanding of the problems that they are working. The hope, sometimes realized, sometimes not, is that being better informed leads to better decisions. The invasion of Iraq is an example where being better informed did not prevent what I regard as a bad decision. It's to provide information. What out of this enormous pile that we collect every day should be passed on to decision makers? In one outburst of the periodic insanity that affects Washington, part of the end of the Cold War, downsizing, right-sizing, proposed to eliminate certain functions of government, including the intelligence community, one of which was the role of analysts. All the information is available. And now the Soviet Union is gone, we don't need secrecy. I suggested that we could do that, but in responding to a question by the Secretary of the Treasury, she probably wouldn't be happy if we wheeled in a wheelbarrow, groaning under the weight of the reports that had come in a previous hour. Somebody needs to sort through that. Somebody needs to look for patterns. Somebody needs to look for the trajectory of events. Try to explain what is driving the chain of events. Try and anticipate where it is going. To be able to answer questions like, do I need to do anything about this? Can I do anything about this? What happens if I don't do anything? Will this problem sort of go away by itself, or will it become a bigger problem? If I act or if I don't act, how is it going to affect my ability to pursue the other 15 objectives you know that I have? That's an everyday part of the world that intelligence analysts live in. What they do is keyed to the missions and the individuals that they support. It's not take all the information available and find interesting things to push into the system. That's for academics to do. It's keyed to a knowledge of what the decision maker is working on, worried about, attempting to manage, how that fits into a larger array of objectives of the individual, of the agency, of the United States government, so that the support can be tailored and timely to get it there when it's needed for decision. One of the differences between the academic world and the world of the intelligence analyst, and I've spent 26 years in each of them. So I consider myself as much a scholar as I do an intelligence professional, is that under my academic hat, I pick questions to work on that I know I can answer. I'll have to do a lot of work, I'll have to dig through information, but I know that information is available. It has to be mined. And I'm going to produce the best article or book that's ever been written about whatever that is, and I have unlimited time to do it. In the world of the intelligence analyst, you don't get to pick. The problems come at you. The expression, stuff happens. The immediate sense is, I need to know yesterday what this means and what I can do about it. So it's always a very short period of time to give it your best shot. A lot of commentary on intelligence, usually intelligence failures. Failed to predict Pearl Harbor, failed to predict the demise of the Soviet Union. If you actually look at this stuff, it's the same 12 or 13 examples stretched over a period of 70 years. Now, we were wrong a lot more than 12 or 13 times. But as I hope I telegraphed in my comment about how many reports have my name on them, the intelligence community, the intelligence, are making dozens, if not hundreds of calls every day. None of them are completely right. Few of them are completely wrong. All of them get revisited. There is no end of history date that is appropriate to pass judgment. The criteria that matters most is, was the input useful? Did it help decision makers to become better informed, maybe more confident about their understanding, maybe a better idea of what to do or to avoid doing? The criteria is not absolute accuracy. Wait for the academic book that will come out 5 years, 10 years later. My seat of the pants, not empirically derived judgment over the years, was the intelligence community got it mostly right, maybe 85% of the time. Academic tomes, mostly right, 85 to 90% of the time. That extra 5% in there. If they got it all right, why are we still writing hundreds of books every year on the origins of World War I? There are still areas for debate, even on frequently reworked subjects. So being timely. Being useful requires knowing what the policy guy is trying to do. Knowing what they think they need to know. I had a boss once, Carl Ford, who summarized it by saying, policymakers always wish they knew the answers to 50, 60, 80 questions about whatever the subject happens to be. If you come in with answers or insight on 4 or 5 of them, you've helped them a lot. And it's almost any 4 or 5 is better than 0 on this, because it helps them to think it through. And this is a partnership. It's not throw it over the transom, dump it into the mail, and assume that it's all self-evident and will be internalized by the intended recipient. And really, it's intended recipients, because products go to, in theory, and most of the time in reality, to each part of the U.S. government, each player in the decision-making process that has a role. In defense, in the State Department, Treasury, Attorney General's office, the National Security Council, wherever it happens to be, so that they're all informed. They've got the same information. They've got the same judgments. But they've got multiple takes on it. Because what the Attorney General needs is very different to what the Secretary of Health and Human Services need to do their job. So the same kinds of information, the same subjects, are all the time reviewed by analysts looking at it through the lens of the responsibilities of their primary customer. And it's the job of the policymakers to sort out how the implications that have been drawn by people with expertise on military affairs should be harmonized with the observations of people with expertise on diplomatic interaction or trade or human rights or whatever it is. There's not a premature effort to homogenize everything, to come out with one unified intelligence community judgment. To do this kind of support, in addition to knowing your customer, knowing the needs, constant interaction, you have to have expertise. And that, as in teaching, that's the sine qua non. If you don't know the subject really well, it's hard to make a contribution. One of the things people coming in from outside tend to get wrong, in my experience, is to assume that the political appointees to executive branch agencies don't know anything. Mostly they do, or they wouldn't have been tapped for that job. I use the example, I worked for 4 years directly for Colin Powell as Secretary of State. I'd known him for 10 years before that. I certainly didn't underestimate his understanding of international affairs, international security affairs. He's an extreme example, but not crazily extreme. So you got to come in holding a pretty good knowledge base. You've got to have access to a lot of information. Some of that information is going to be classified. It's seldom a decisive factor, in my experience. There are certain things like counterterrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, international crime, money laundering, and kind of where you need the classified information. You can't cull through the journalistic and academic reporting to identify who the bad guys are and what their target might be. So it's important on some issues, much less important on most issues. To underscore a point I made, you have to understand what the information, what the insights are needed for. What are they trying to do? One of the enormous gaps in the classic described by a mentor to both Harry and to me, Alex George, the gap between academic expertise and policymaker needs. Most of what academics do could be useful if presented properly. It's not useful because it's thrown into the process without regard to who needs it, when do they need it, what do they already know, what are they trying to accomplish. And it can be the greatest report in the world. It's also true of stuff done inside the intelligence. It can be super. If it gets there 20 minutes after the decision is made, it doesn't matter. It's good for one thing, lining bird cages. It has no policy relevance at that point. So knowing what is needed, knowing what people know, knowing what the decision makers think they know, interacting with them frequently and with a trusted relationship that permits a judgment about what they think they know that's wrong, what they should have asked but didn't ask for. INR, where I spent most of my career in government, almost never received formal assignments from policymakers. Analysts were expected to know because they sat in meetings, they had frequent conversations, they talked to subordinates, know what the issue was and the timeline was, and to know enough about the issues to be able to determine what they ought to analyze and how to present it, who takes information through their eyes, who wants it through their ears, who wants it through a staff person to adjust it. Case of President Reagan, he wanted it on videotape. That's how he took information. You have to understand that. The intelligence function kind of runs constantly in the background of the policymaking process. Analysts are doing their thing. They're updating their understanding. They're talking to the counterparts in the policy world. They're supporting case of State Department, embassies and consulates around the world. So Haiti doesn't very often make it to the top of the U.S. foreign policy agenda. The embassy in Port-au-Prince, the Organization of American States and the U.S. delegation there, they want, need, expect support every day on those issues. So you've got a lot of stuff going on that only episodically makes it to the top of the system. It's part of the fire extinguisher function. An illustration of that tough question. So this is a wicked problem. Somalia in the 90s. Clans and sub-clans. The war that overthrew the government, it created chaos, aggravated the effects of famine. Who could make sense out of what was going on? It turned out we had an analyst. Stan Shaloff, in graduate school, became enamored of clans and sub-clans. Stan did pretty routine things all the time. He came to me one day and said, "I'm finished." Finished with what, Stan? I've written 469 daily updates on what is happening in Somalia. And the Africa Bureau finally said they don't need any more of those. Can you imagine how much knowledge and information it takes to write 469 pieces on what was going on? And then Stan went back into, not hibernation, but to working on other things. Keeping that kind of expertise, cultivating that kind of expertise, allowing people to be on the job. It's another difference between academe. In academe, we got to mentor students, teach classes, promote the university, raise funding, report to those who provide money, and so forth. The intelligence analyst's job is to know their subject. That's what they do all day, every day. And if it's hot, it's all night too. You're on the job until you're not needed. Another difference is that when do you go to the intelligence community if you've got a problem? You go when, if you're a policy, you know you don't know enough. You know you don't have enough information. You know you don't have enough time to get the information that you'd like to have. And you know it could be consequential, so you're going to have to make a decision to act or not act. And if you decide to act, what are you going to do on this? Before the clock ticks around to whatever the perceived deadline is on it. So the intelligence people are always working with I got to give it my best shot. Based on what I know, based on who I can talk to, based on how we can quickly mine the pile of information. It always impressed me by how often we are able to answer questions. I mentioned yesterday that INR had a compact with the rest of the State Department that we'd answer any question in 5 minutes. Sounds outrageous, doesn't it? A lot of times the answer to the question within 5 minutes was, I have no goddamn idea. But that answer coming from people whose job it was to follow that subject area was telling. It was usually followed by, we can get you an answer in a couple hours, in a day, maybe a week on it. When do you need it? What do you need it for in there? But at the pace of which decisions move, saying, there's no point in waiting. We can't answer that question for you on your decision timeline, so good luck. How else can we help you? What can we do to take it the next step? A lot of work of it is mundane. Monitoring developments within the countries or the issues in the portfolio. Checking. Every day usually begins with what have the newspapers, media said about the subject overnight? Which is right, which is wrong, which is partly wrong, partly right. Where is it right, where is it wrong? All of that is not done to give a report card to journalists. It's because the newspapers, the TV broadcasts, now social media stuff, that goes to constituents who sometimes get spun up about it, exercised, and they contact members of Congress. And the first thing members of Congress do is tell their staff to call the relevant executive branch and say, what are you doing about this? Not is it right or wrong, it's what are you doing about this? And the United States sort of has to be on top of give or take everything. Not just because we're a global player with interest around the world, and we've got all of the tendencies of a meddlesome mother-in-law that thinks it can fix anything, any place in the world, but because we are a nation of immigrants from everywhere, that people hear from their relatives, or they see reports of something happening in the homeland, and they contact their members of Congress, or they contact their college roommate who's now somewhere in the executive branch. And that becomes a triggering event that requires following lots of stuff. A flip side of being from everywhere is the capacity to do stuff that never ceased to amaze me. At one point, I was down in a kind of bullpen area of low-walled semi-office in Division Carroll's. And somebody came in and say, we've got a lot of new information on attacks on refugees fleeing out of Rwanda. And they're being attacked by the Banyamulenge. Now, I'd worked on and off on Africa for about a decade at that point. I said, who the hell are the Banyamulenge? I never heard of the Banyamulenge. Any of you people know where the Banyamulenge is? And a voice pops up. Said, what do you want to know about the Banyamulenge? These are my people. I'm a Banyamulenge American. Well, that example can be repeated over and over again. I said, Thule, you're not my Banyamulenge analyst. To get that insight, the ability to reach out into the larger American body politic and get insight is a tremendous asset that we use. That thinking beyond the immediate questions, the immediate policy challenges, to larger strategic kinds of concerns, to the wicked challenges, the mega trends and developments that are the subject of the Global Trends series here, and the role for that. When we started that, first one we did was in 1996. And I went to my analysts in INR and I said, we're going to do this new thing. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to try doing a lookout 15 years using classified information. The National Intelligence Council is going to do the same thing using no classified information. A couple of analysts came back to me pretty quick and said, how the hell are we supposed to do this? We have no information 15 years in the future. How can we analyze things that we can't do empirically? There was a learning process. It took us 4 iterations, so over 12 years, to be able to be comfortable doing this, but to get at some hard problems. I'll return to the global trends in a second. But the need to be nimble and move on developments anywhere in the world it's not just an American conceit. A couple of examples I think will underscore how everything is connected to everything else. Developments anywhere, it can affect developments everywhere. Think back to the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2022. The almost immediate predictions that this was going to cause a food crisis in Africa. If Ukrainian grain did not move, prices would spike, there'd be less available, starvation leading to migration, leading to instability in neighboring countries or crossing the Mediterranean into Europe. Well, of course, that didn't happen. No one thought about it, and I'm sure the folks who were in government after I left, markets work. We have a North Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere and Argentina and other Southern Hemisphere planted more grain, made up for a lot of it in a hurry. India forbade exports. That had domestic consequences. Being able to think through how these things are interconnected. The famines in Africa periodically, or now almost chronically, particularly in the Horn. We care about that, of course, for humanitarian reasons. We also care about it because of migrants crossing into Europe, the perceived destabilizing impact within the European Union, or many countries in the European Union. Implications for aid programs, food aid programs. Of course, we want to provide food to hungry people. The famines in the Horn of Africa are going on for a long time. Some from drought, some from locusts, some from plant disease. But one thing we know for sure is when you provide food aid for hungry people, you drive farmers out of business. Farmers can't compete with free. So the short term undermines long term. So figuring out ways to balance that is part of the wicked problem set that policymakers turn to intelligence analysts because they're there, like money in the bank to Willie Sutton. A third was polio. I was a polio pioneer in 1952. What that means is I got one of the experimental Salk vaccines, first that proved successful. And what used to be an endemic disease around the world, by the end of the last century, had been pretty much confined to northern Nigeria. almost totally eliminated in the rest of the world. And then it began to spread again. Policy guys came to me and said, we need help. The problem seems to be two religious leaders in northern Nigeria who have convinced themselves or been convinced that polio vaccination is a Christian plot to sterilize Muslims and had forbade vaccination. People move around. They got in trucks and drove with their crops to other places. Some got on airplanes. And pretty quickly, we had it in Pakistan. We had it in a number of other places. I remember the question, who can persuade these religious leaders to allow vaccination? Who will they listen to? Are there pharmaceutical companies run by Muslims that manufacture or could manufacture the vaccines involved? And we need it right now. Well, we tracked down this stuff eventually. It had spread, I think, to 14 countries. It's now beginning to contract again. But that it can affect anybody here, the United States, matters. Climate change, the effects of climate change. The UN studies that predict many serious, even dire implications. I'll leave out the run-up, but basically I got tasked by the U.S. Congress, Senate, to do a study of the geopolitical effects of climate change. Okay. Based on what? We don't do climate change. So we had to develop a methodology that used the UN mid-range estimate. We said, well, if it's right or wrong, we're going to take that as a starting point. And we can't do all of the conceivable implications. We're going to do a few. Sea level rise, water availability, and impact on food. What difference to food production will it make? A degree or 2 degrees change in temperature. How will that affect pests that eat crops? How will that affect the spread of disease and so forth? We had to make up a methodology in order to begin to get at the problem. Because the UN projections were out 50 years. Some of the European projections, very well done, out 75 years, 100 years. As a political analyst, there's no way in hell I can hold politics constant for 50 years. So we sucked it back to looking at 30 years and then backed it up a little more to 25 years. One of the reasons we picked it, there was unanimity in the science community that nothing we could do in 2007 when we started would have any impact for 25 years. There was no way to prevent the changes that were going to happen in a short period of time. So we went at how many people are affected in which place? In what way would they be affected? Can the governments of these places manage the challenges? Which ones could, which one couldn't? What kind of help might they need? What's the capacity to it? How honest or corrupt are they? Where might you put aid? How might you organize it in there? A lot of policy questions that we aimed, in response to an instruction, to provide insight to decision makers to start thinking about what the United States should be prepared to do. Do you respond to where the first problem first arises? Do you limit it to your friends and allies and partners? Do you limit it or direct it originally to places that migration might be the most destabilizing in whatever way you define that? That these studies that were out there, and you say, oh, this is all speculation. The academic world could do this. Academic world could do this, should do this. What it wouldn't have is the appreciation for how do these observations get translated into proposals within a government to act? And how do they affect the 15, 18, 20 other things? In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to do very quickly some other examples of nuclear stability. That we've been very lucky for 70 years that first the USSR and then Russia and the United States managed to avoid nuclear annihilation by sharing information, by developing control regimes. The world has managed to limit the proliferation to additional players. The Kennedy administration predicted by, I think it was 1980, that there'd be 32 nuclear countries. There's still 9. That it's limiting, but as we go to the quest for green technologies, nuclear looks like it's a more and more essential part of it, which spreads nuclear technology, which produces nuclear waste. What do you do with it? Where do you put it? What scale? Who should monitor this? We've got developments. The PRC is expanding its nuclear arsenal. We can debate how much. Analysts will argue about that. But the question is not what is China doing. It's how do you get China to sit down and talk? It refuses to come. To talk arms control talks. Doesn't do arms control talks on it. Managing Russia from after the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, the two sides got scared straight, and so we needed regular channels to reduce misperception here. What are you doing with that? A place to go to ask questions to get answers, to build up. Well, these talks that had lasted from 1962 were terminated when the Russians annexed Crimea. The U.S. followed the European lead on military-to-military talks. These ended. It took a matter of months before both sides said, too dangerous. We got to find a way to do this, to talk. I know a little bit about this because I co-chaired the unofficial talks. They were unofficial, but the participants were appointed by the U.S. Strategic Command and the Chief of Staff in the Russian Armed Forces as a place to deal with the issues. Understanding, exchange of information, sharing information with the International Atomic Energy, all of these are functions based in intelligence, filtered through policymaking, that have to lead to international consultation, if not collaboration. There's a long list of issues that can't be managed by any single country. That can't be managed without the cooperation of key countries. U.S. and China are two of those key countries. How do you get to discussions on international terrorism, dealing with water problems, sea level problems, making sure that the actions that one takes or one set of countries takes to ameliorate effects of climate change or pandemic responses don't make it worse because they're not coordinated with the steps that other international actors are taking. The wicked problems are wicked in part because they're really hard, in part because they can't be easily addressed by a single government. It requires getting in the heads of the other. How do they perceive the problem? What's the outcome that they want? How does that track with the outcome that we think we want? Who can persuade third countries to play in this arena. We got stuck in the talks with the Russians on next steps beyond New START. Without China in the talks, neither side had a basis for further reductions. Both wanted to reduce, but what do you reduce? How do you reduce it? Making that happen. How do others perceive the problem? How do others propose to address it? How do we propose to address the problem? How will that be received by others? There's a lot of this realm of speculation that passes through strategic analysis, but it's only what can be done. So you can get a trial balloon and test it in the real world. I'm going to stop here rather than give more examples that I've been involved in, but they include such things as using intelligence to respond to the tsunami that hit Aceh 2005. Using our capabilities, overhead satellite capabilities, to identify where roads were washed out, bridges were down, dams that were at risk of breaking, producing maps on military ships that got printed out and flown by helicopters to some of my people who were in Aceh, got to Aceh right away, posted up so that aid organizations from around the world could, who said, we got this sector, take a photograph of it, pulling together information from missionaries, from anybody that could report on, I was just in this place and here's the situation. Intelligence is kind of structured to do that kind of stuff. Because it's structured to do that stuff, it gets more and more requests to do it, which makes it harder and harder to do the other stuff. We need one another, and I need to stop here and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fingar, and thank you all for paying attention despite lunch waiting outside. I thought it was fantastic, Tom, having been with Tom yesterday. Still so much to learn, so much to hear. So we know this is an audience that is also has many, many good questions, and seeing so many students from NCCU, where I also have taught for the College of Social Science, is a great pleasure for CAPRI to be here, to be part of this event. So why don't we open the floor? And I don't know if there are mics going, oh, there's mics on your desk. Please feel free to raise your hand to the extent that I can see you. Please. Yes. If you could introduce yourself and your department.
Yes, I'm not from the university. I'm from the foreign policy community. I'm from the delegation of the European Union. My name is Alexandra. I have two easy questions. One, about how would you judge the role of national intelligence in policy making, but more foreign policy or domestic policy? This is the first question. And the second, also easy question, being in a Taiwan context, I cannot not ask a question about the elephant in the room. So with the centralization of decision-making in CCP across the strait, is it easier for intelligence community to read Xi Jinping mind, or on the contrary? Thank you.
The role of intelligence in foreign policy and national policy. You know, I'll confine my remarks to the United States. It is different in other countries. That the U.S. intelligence apparatus was constructed to support foreign and defense policies, national security, the national security enterprise, which once upon a time was the Defense Department and the State Department. It's now broadened to U.S. Trade Representative Office, the Treasury, the Attorney General, the Health and Human Services, Centers for Disease Control, that sort of we've defined security as anything that could threaten the health, well-being, safety of American citizens at home and abroad. Pretty ambitious set of responsibilities in this. And intelligence, again, really simplifying, exists in part to identify threats to individuals and interests, to explain and assess developments that might have an impact, negative or positive, on American firms, American NGOs, and citizens, and might be the subject of policy decisions and negotiations with partners and allies, or taking it to the United Nations or one of its subordinate organizations. So it's there to deepen understanding, sometimes to provide more information about a subject. Something I did not mention was to inform other governments. Intelligence is used regularly to inform other governments about the basis, the empirical basis, and the analytic judgments that underlie American policy decisions. So it's not just the intelligence makes its input and decision maker make good, bad, or indifferent decisions, and they carry it out and tell people about it. It's after those decisions are made, they turn back to the intelligence community and say, go explain to our friends in Madrid or Pretoria or Beijing or wherever it is why we have adopted the position we have on Iranian nuclear policy, North Korean missile development. So there's a fair amount of sharing of analytic judgments with other countries. And I continue to be surprised by this in the counterterrorism. We had an intelligence sharing relation with Sudan that because we had a shared interest in identifying and neutralizing terrorists that were using Sudan as a base. So strange bedfellows kind of thing where you had common interests in them. Domestic policy, that's almost a total no-go area for the U.S. intelligence community. That by law, by practice, and by social conventions, the shorthand, we don't spy on Americans. So even using the capacities of the intelligence community for domestic purposes is very sensitive in there. A concrete example, terrorist threats to major sporting events. We picked up information about threats to things like the Super Bowl or college bowl games or major soccer tournaments. How do you monitor these things? Use the satellites, right? Let them watch over the stadium. Can't do it. No spying on Americans. It took writing special legislation to create limited circumstances in which that is doable. This doesn't apply to most other countries. For the U.S., it has to pass a law enforcement threshold. You need a court order. You have to persuade a judge that the possibility of a crime or exists or has been committed to go. And it is a tricky, one of the trickiest part of my deputy director of national intelligence job, pulling together at the time 17 intelligence agencies. Challenging, but that paled in comparison to pulling together the 18,000 state, local, and tribal police departments in the United States, to get them to share information. And on the end-to-end, it starts abroad, it crosses the border, it's now inside the United States, and people move around all over the United States, the different jurisdictions, because we don't have a Ministry of State Security, internal security, and there's deep, deep resistance to create anything that looks like, including in the law enforcement community. The role of intelligence in domestic policy is very, very limited. Thanks for the question. Xi Jinping, that's right. The decision. I am quite disappointed by the current state of discourse on CCP or Beijing or PRC kind of intentions. To me, there's incredible laziness by throwing things into the revival of great power competition bucket, or autocracy versus democracy explanation, or Xi Jinping decides everything, strongest leader since Mao, whatever the hell that means, that it doesn't illuminate priorities, decision-making on particular issues, how they will respond to local government debt, the absence of decent elder policies, healthcare inadequacies, whether to build more military hardware or spend more money training people to use that hardware, on and on and on. Decision-making remains a black box. So going at it is saying, we don't know. So let's have a worst case, what can our imagination pull together as the worst it might do? We ought to do better than that. We ought to think, which means speculate, creatively based in what are the issues? What are the problems that the folks in Beijing have to deal with? Can't ignore. They're structured to bring them to the attention of Xi or the standing committee or whatever the process is on it, to say, if you do that, here are the consequences. Here are the implications. Here are the things that are not going to happen. Here are the things we can't do. Here's how that might play in social media, in public discontent, in economic disruption of the behavior of foreign firms. We can, I think that through. That's the expertise. That's the area studies. That's the insights out of comparative politics that are there. That will we be right? No, not completely. Will we have something more useful than saying it's all about Xi Jinping? In my view, it's not all about Xi Jinping. That if he got run over by a bus tomorrow, the answer to the question, what would change? My answer is Xi wouldn't be at the meeting. The system's not going to change. And what drives the decisions is not just one personality here. And I go through this at length because the role of analysis, whether it's academic or inside an intelligence agency, sure, there's a little more secret information available inside. In my view, on this kind of question, most of that information isn't very helpful. It's not as helpful as rigorous thinking through of parameters and constraints and perceptions and prioritizations that can be gleaned from public statements, from observation, and from interaction at all kinds of levels. I'm sorry I forgot that the first time.
That's okay. Thank you, actually, Dr. Fingar. In addition, of course, to Dr. Fingar, both Wang Ying and I think Dean Yang and Professor Harding can have lots to add to that question. If we have a bit more time, I might ask but the two of you to talk about today's state of analyzing the CCP and Xi Jinping. But we have already several questions. First one from this gentleman and the next two. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Dr. Fingar. I am Captain KK from India, Maritime Security Scholar. attached to the NCCU as a MOFA fellow. It's more of a curiosity rather than a question. Is the monitoring and analysis of political situation in so-called stable countries or your allies or partners on a daily basis the part of charter of CIA? And in case there is a situation developing in any of these countries, does the CIA limit itself, as you said, to only providing information and insight? Or does it suggest certain courses of action based on some kind of a war gaming or whatever that you may term it as? Thank you.
If I've interpreted your question correctly, the core is this: the intelligence community look at partners and allies and friends and stable countries or only problem countries. The answer is yes, that mostly not by collecting intelligence or clandestine collection of intelligence. We go ask, right? Go ask for documents, have a conversation about it. But do we try to understand decision-making, Modi's policies inside India, economic policies, relationship with Moscow, conflict with China? Yes. We try to understand what the dynamics are, what the objectives are, to deduce motivation from behavioral patterns. That's surely going on now with Netanyahu and the assault on Gaza, to figure out what might be a viable proposal to end that conflict and carnage in a way that protect Israelis' interests and survival on it. So the answer is yes. So draw a line between, do we spy on our friends? Mostly not. Do we share intelligence with friends so they understand where? Do we exchange information? Yes. And one of the realities is we learn a lot about our partner from the dialogue about what we share on third countries, on international problems. As they ask questions, tell us the way they perceive it. So you can do it in dialogue. You don't have to do it clandestinely. Do we war game? The intelligence community doesn't do much except for that part of it that supports military. The military war games all the time, and they include an intelligence component in doing it. But the intelligence community per se for political games, how will events play out in Cuba? Not much of that gets done.
Thank you. This gentleman here.
Hi, Tom. I was overlapped with you at Stanford. I was doing my PhD there when you were there at APARC. I guess you're still there at APARC. So the privatization of the security and tactical units has received a lot of press. Blackwater was in the news a lot, but privatization of the intelligence sector seems to get less coverage. I don't know if this is true, but I hear that Palantir representatives are in the room sometimes when policy decisions are being made or policy decisions are being discussed. So that their role coordinating intelligence and converting intelligence to policy possibly is much bigger than we realize. I just wanted to ask, how significant is this shift, do you think, towards the hybrid kind of public-private sharing of intelligence analysis and policymaking? And do they have different cultures and skill sets? And what are the costs and benefits do you foresee of this trend? If it's a trend?
Good to see you again. A three-part response to this also great simplification. The secular trend that you mentioned of more, call it private intelligence analysis entering into the process. Clearly it's happening. That a lot of it is linked to golly gee whiz algorithms that will solve all your problems. You have dumb analysts, we'll make them smart with our computer program kind of stuff. That gets called to the attention of government by the K Street lobbyists and contacts through Congress that mandates that we buy some of this stuff. So far, it mostly overpromises and underdelivers, but it is another input that intelligence at one level competes with input from diplomacy within the bureaucracy. College classmates who call up a senior official, foreign governments, the media, influential members of Congress. There is no end, it seems, of people who have ideas, recommendations, demands that they level on the decision makers. In an abstract sense, the intelligence community is one more voice in the cacophony. But among the things that make it different, most important is the access, direct access to the decision maker. They know what they're working on, what they think, what they need, and so forth. The other is the presumed objectivity, that the intelligence community is supposed to be the most objective analytic input that reaches a decision maker. I happen to believe most of the time that's right, but most of the time, the policy guys I've worked with assume that everybody else that's making an input has an agenda. Their analysis is skewed to support what they want to have happen. And that makes the intelligence component more valued. The third aspect that makes it different is this continuous feedback and interaction. It's not, I write an analysis, I throw it in somebody's inbox, and I'm done with it. The questioning about it, the can I see your sources? That challenges an assumption that I've had. You actually have a dialogue about it. It's going to be made even more complicated because of AI. Anybody that can buy the right bot, an algorithm can generate analyses of some. Some will be good, some will be bad. It'll get better over time. For the foreseeable future, any decision maker, before acting on what an algorithm tells them, which is an abdication of decision-making authority, is going to go to the intelligence community and say, what do you think of this? How does it track with the old-fashioned way in which you do it? But the old-fashioned way is going to be incorporating increasing amounts of input from the new technologies. We're on the verge of a new world, and that is in so many other areas. But I think the role for the private inputting or machine inputting is going to be limited, because I just don't see many people who go through the effort to get elected or appointed to senior decision-making. Always say, you don't need me anymore. Ask the robot. That is such an abdication of responsibility and ambition. I just don't see it happen.
Thank you. There's one question there, and it will be the last question. Now we have three more. Okay, everyone rushes in. Next one first. Yeah, right here. Yes.
So I read an article not long ago regarding the terrorist attack that happened in Moscow, right? And the U.S. intelligence community said that it shared information about that attack before it happened with the Russian government. And they did not or failed to act on that intelligence for whatever reason. Or I'm wondering, does the U.S. intelligence community see sharing intelligence with not necessarily rival states, but states that aren't allied with the U.S. as a tool for building rapport? And is that actually that effective, or does it just breed resentment in states that then receive some intelligence from the U.S. government, even though we say this is in your interest to know this? Would they just go, oh, but you shouldn't be meddling, so we resent the meddling, etc.? Or is it sometimes received well by other states?
Can I have your name, please, and your organization?
My name is Sean McAvoy. I'm a master's student at North Carolina State University.
A granddaughter goes to NC State. I should be delighted to know I saw somebody here. That this is a it depends kind of situation. That taking the terrorist example that you frame, there's almost a moral imperative. If we know or think there's a high probability of an attack on human beings, civilians outside of a theater of war, thing, that no official in my experience is going to want to go to the Hill and say, yeah, we know about, we didn't tell them. The Moscow example, I don't know the details, but there were Americans at that event. You want to say, yeah, we thought there might be Americans there, but we didn't want to share. So the imperatives are different depending on the circumstances. Having done a lot of intel sharing in my career, the very first question always is, how do you know that? That's a counterintelligence question, right? We want to know how you know about this stuff involving us so we can shut down access to other things that we don't want you to know about. So you usually get in a dialogue of, trust me, we're confident of this, and I can't tell you much more, or I can tell you a little more. So there is that dynamic to it. Another is building confidence. That in reality, we very seldom have a dichotomous, there are good guys and there are bad guys. And we don't tell the bad guys anything on there. Because you want to work together on some of these international issues, counterproliferation, counterterrorism, dealing with the next pandemic disease, and so forth. So you build openings where you can, you build individual relationships that are in there. Two examples that I'll use to illustrate this. I made two different trips to Moscow. One on Afghanistan, where I was sent by the state, I was actually in Pakistan and Afghanistan, late 90s, to assess situation. Got told, get to Moscow. Moscow wanted, I think, laudable reasons to limit, if not stop, the carnage that was occurring at that time. I briefed the vice foreign minister in front of a gaggle of American and Russian officials. Sitting opposite me was my counterpart on the Russian foreign minister, who was all puffed up because he's going to get his time in front of the vice minister. I finished, and the vice minister said, that's exactly the way we see it. We don't need to give you our view. That's exactly the way we see it. Now, what are we going to do? What can we do in the UN? What can we do with our partner states in Central Asia and in South Asia to stop the smuggling of fuel for airplanes, of ammunition for certain kinds of weapons? That was one experience. Another one was I went to lay out American judgments of the North Korean nuclear program. And then that one response was, thank you very much, you're wrong. We don't see it that way. How do you see it? Not like that. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
I know I have 3 more questions. We're going to start from here, and there was one in the middle and one on the left. So I'll start, please.
Thank you, Dr. Finger. My name is Austin Wei. I'm from CAPRI. It's an honor to be here in your talk. I have 2 questions. One is regarding the governing of intelligence.
The what?
The governing of intelligence. I was wondering what's the current response around the world where they, especially at the governmental levels, because all the private enterprise and international companies, such as Google, Facebook, they have the most repository of the data collected. What will be the government response to cooperate with the private enterprise to create a more timely decision-making, policies or choices to respond to all the crises happening at this stage? And my second question has to do with the interpretation of the intelligence. We know that throughout the entire process, the intelligence bureau needs to feed in the facts or the data to the policymakers to make major decisions. What's your experience throughout your entire career that to prevent the facts from being misinterpreted by the policymakers in order to make the most non-biased and correct decision makings for the nations? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 2 good questions. On the relationship to, let's just call it social media, companies or communication folks more broadly in there. Real example, as facial recognition stuff was beginning to take off 20 years ago, we were preparing to seek reauthorization of the legislation that allows wiretapping, court-authorized wiretapping by the FBI, or if Americans are involved in an overseas activity. And the question came up, what about facial recognition? New technology, shouldn't we have it? How do we build that in? And this was before kind of China doing this on a wholesale basis, and this is well before that. And kind of the decision was, we got trying to do a lot of stuff here. We don't need to do that. Facebook has the largest repository of images of anybody in the world. They collect it, people put it in free. That they clearly don't assume privacy when they post it on Facebook and other things. If we need it, we'll ask for it in there. Which is a little trickier than that. That companies don't want to rely on being asked by the government. So we had to craft legislation not specific to Facebook or to imagery, but basically enabled the government to compel companies to make the information available. We're happy to, some of them say, we're happy to give this to you, but we got to protect ourselves legally and reputation-wise. So you got to go to court. You got to get an injunction of some kind and make us do it, and then we'll do it. And that's the way it still works, in my understanding. In the preventing misconceptions, one of the analysts get tired of Finger beating on this drum over the years was, if what you write, what you say is misinterpreted, that's your fault. you've got to wring the ambiguity out of your judgments. Because if it can be misinterpreted, if it can be misconstrued, it will be by somebody in there. So take it back and write it again. Make it clear what your call is. That's one of those things that's almost diametrically opposite a lot of academic writing, even if it doesn't say on the one hand or on the other hand. It's written in a way that no matter what happened, you were right. You were right. See, I pointed at that. That's not helpful to a decision maker. They want a call on it. And it's not just the individual analyst, it's the process's responsibility to spot it. That can be interpreted multiple ways. We ought to say what we think it is, or say clearly, we can't make a call.
So the responsibility is still the analyst. Absolutely. Thank you. This gentleman in the middle, and next, last one there. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Fingar. Thank you very much for your insights. My name is Karol Jan Horodecki. I'm a young graduate from Yushan University. And you already mentioned that intelligence is connected to diplomacy. Would you be able to elaborate how it connects to defense diplomacy? And perhaps you could define defense diplomacy and what role intelligence plays in it? Thank you very much.
The first part of your question, I thought I heard defense diplomacy. The second part, I thought I heard defense policy.
No, defense diplomacy.
Say it again?
Defense diplomacy.
Okay, diplomacy.
Yeah,
well, it's important to distinguish between things like the NATO alliance and the sharing of information within the alliance structure. That where it involves, acquisition questions, deployment questions, support questions, logistics stuff, it's a lot of detailed sharing because it has to be. Because everybody wants it to be effective, right? Nobody wants to have an operation fail because their link in the chain was not based on the same understanding. But the world is complicated, and our relationship with our NATO allies, specifically in Europe, is complicated because within NATO you share everything with the caveat that this is military, right? And the expectation that in many organizations, militaries leak. The U.S. military leaks, NATO allies leak. So it's not that it's dumbed down, it's just limited. It's sort of confidential, maybe up to secret, is what gets shared. But many of the NATO partners are also EU members and interact with us. And it's unfortunately the reality that we get information given to us about third countries by partners, not in the NATO context, but in a bilateral relationship or related to the EU. It says, we're giving this to you and you can't share it with other EU members, or you can't share it with specific other members of the EU. It used to drive me nuts. In the same way that interacting with South Korea and Japan, it would drive Americans nuts. You got to repeat the same thing twice or 10 times because they're fractured internally on this. So it's not a straightforward answer that for defense diplomacy, getting people to hang together on support for Ukraine, which is not just a military thing, it's even more a political thing, and a very impressive set of developments that's occurred in the last 2 years, I think would not have been predicted to have occurred. That's different, and it requires interactions that go far beyond the how many helicopters can you bring to the party kind of a discussion. And nation states have different priorities, different perceptions. Their publics expect and demand different things. So one size fits all usually doesn't fit anybody. So you have to figure out how to tailor it, and that gets back to the question asked by the Indian gentleman here. You have to know something about your partner, even though a good ally, about what are the pressures that he or she is under to do this? What are the domestic goals that are to be addressed through this military-related set of activities? Do they need support to allow the use of airfields to move supplies in there? What's the issue? And for some people, this, whoa. This takes us into, are we spying on our allies and partners? No, we're analyzing the best way to accomplish shared goals. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. In our very little time left, last question here. We can make it brief. Thank you.
Wiki problems are by nature complex, which describes the state between order and chaos. Because experts are not omniscient and can have blind spots, we should tap into wisdom of crowd to solve complex problems to ensure diversity of opinions and independence of thought, as suggested by James Surowiecki, the author of the book, The Wisdom of Crowd. So in his book, he even suggested to use prediction markets, also known as decision markets, to enhance intelligence work. It was rejected by some Congress members because betting on disasters and crises comes with social stigma. Now the question is, what is your stance on using prediction markets as a way to tap into crowd wisdom to help with intelligence work?
Sorry, can you identify yourself? Thank you.
My name is Nick, and I'm a civic technologist.
I actually don't have a position on prediction markets. Prediction markets were just coming into existence when I was the deputy DNI. And they clearly can be useful in some circumstances, that in some ways it turns every issue into something where you get a bell curve of understanding and predictions. And you can kind of construct that without going out and talking to a lot of people, without having them buy into it and say, what's the range of the possible? What's the midpoint? Is the top of the bell curve to the left or the right of center, and get pretty close. There are issues, I'm sure. Economic forecasting, where expectations of consumer behavior or firm behavior can be enlightened by that. Where I have trouble getting my head around it, in part because I don't know what people did after I left, but where this technique seemed to be most useful was in areas called economics, the economic arena, where I say, why are intelligence analysts spending a lot of time? Why don't we go talk to the folks on Wall Street that do this and you can say, well, that's a kind of a prediction market. It's a glorified Delphi technique, right? You ask everybody their opinion on something, and you get a distribution on it. It's about as good as the experience and expertise of the people you ask on it. So it's another tool. It's not a magic bullet as far as I'm concerned. And just the general point, intelligence analysts have been oversold on magic bullet solutions over and over and over. So they are probably more skeptical about using tools, in quotes, than they should be. It's harder to get them to adopt it. It's like Lucy and the football, right? That you pull it away again and again and again, and the analyst is just not willing to buy in.
Thank you, Tom. That was really an excellent question and answer. Went on longer than we expected. Before I hand it over to Dean Young to wrap it up, I wanted to thank all of you, and it's an honor to CAPRI to be a part of it. We ask you for a small favor. As a small organization with our host, we very much like your input and hope that you'll get invited to the next one that we work on together.
Well, I think Shelley already concluded for today's talk. I really want to thank Dr. Fingar for give his, after another 10 years, I think his first visit to Taiwan had been last century story, right? And then for the last 10 years, he has been the opportunity to visit Taiwan. I'm so glad for that he gave this opportunity to our NCCU. And he has shared so many insightful his experience, his perspective, and so many issues have been touched upon, whether it's about food shortage, the mass destruction weapon, or the anti-terrorist, or the Soviet Union, or the elephant in the room, China. Everything have been included. And I have to say that I personally learned a lot, and I believe that most of our audience here have, whether you are practitioner, decision maker, or student professors, I believe you have benefited from today's talk. And in the end, I have certainly have the soul that when we say nowadays it's the AI, the artificial intelligence, is a buzzword. But through today's talk, I hope you feel the same like I do, that human intelligence is even more complicated and charming. And so we will have more to explore in the future. And I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to work together, and we will cooperate in the future again. And thank you, Dr. Fingar, and hope you enjoy your stay in Taiwan. And and thank you all for coming today. Thank you all.